ripped apart and dissolved over the course of the next few years. Now, everyone thinks that this started with the Trump administration, and as soon as Trump is gone, we'll go back to normal. But no, not in the way that people are thinking. We are going back to a normal international environment. It's not normal in the way that we've traditionally thought about it for the last couple of generations. The problem is that normal is not an international order. In fact, there's only ever been one international order. It is now going away. We're shifting into a period of disorder, which is much more traditionally what the world looks like. Well, you've got to take a step back, way back, really to the beginning of the industrial period, or before if you want to. The point was, there are very few places in the world that have a good geography internally that allows them to consolidate into a single ethnic group and do so in a way that generates wealth. You need flat land, you need good agricultural space, you need a good river so you can move things around in your own system. That doesn't happen in large portions of the planet. And even that isn't quite enough. You have to have significant barriers between you and your neighbors, otherwise you'll tend to get invaded every generation or two. This means that in the world before what we consider normal, there were really only about a dozen significant powers, and they would branch out beyond these core zones as empires in order to conquer large tracts of territory and use those resources to feed their populations, to trade, to have captive markets, and ultimately to outcompete everyone else who's among those 12. This led to wars, a lot of them, constantly. Bigger and badder wars as the industrial period built. Eventually got things like tanks and artillery and ultimately hydrogen bombs. That led to World War II. That brought the entire system crashing down. And of those 12 geographies in the world, only one of them wasn't leveled, and that was the United States. So at the end of World War II, the Americans brought their allies together at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and basically held a conference and laid out what the rules of the new age were going to be. So instead of everyone competing for global domination, it's pretty clear the United States held all the tools here, had the only global navy, had the only economy that had survived the war, had the only industrial base. So the Americans proposed a trade. We'll open our markets to you so you can export your way back to affluence. We'll use our navy to patrol the global oceans so that you can buy any product from anywhere in the world, ship it home, process it into finished goods, and then re-export it for hard currency. We'll protect the entire supply chain. You're not any longer limited to the territory in which you directly control. You can access everything. And in exchange, all we ask is for the right to protect you from the Soviets. And for all the empires, there was a degree of confusion went up on here. So they're like, okay, let me get this right. You're going to give us for free everything that we have been struggling to achieve ourselves for the last 1,000 years, and you're going to protect us. Deal. That's the Cold War. This is NATO. This is the European Union. This is the Chinese Communist Party. Because the beauty of the Bretton Woods deal was you could extend it to new members at any time. And as the 40s turned into the 50s, turned into the 60s, turned into the 70s, the Bretton Woods alliance continued to expand and expand and expand, providing the economic basis for the Soviet containment strategy. And that lasted right up until the end of the Cold War. The problem is when the Cold War ended, all of a sudden the security strategy needed to be updated, which meant that the global economic system needed to be updated. Because for the Americans, trade wasn't about trade. Trade was about security. That's the bribe you use to get cooperation. The president we had at the time was Herbert Walker Bush, someone who was well positioned in terms of understanding foreign affairs, know how to play it forward. And he put together a team to figure out what's next. How do we take Bretton Woods and update it for this new strategic era? But Americans voted him out of office. And in the next 6 consecutive federal election contests, Americans decisively chose the candidate who celebrated his lack of foreign expertise. So the economic aspects of the Bretton Woods system kind of lingered on. The idea that the US will provide security for global trade, that will lubricate the system financially, that the Americans will be the market of first and last resort. But the idea that there was any sort of quid pro quo, that faded away. And in a series of events, the Americans became disenchanted with the system because now they were subsidizing countries that were no longer under their security umbrella. Places became more powerful, your Brazils, your Indias, especially your Chinas. I would say that the three landmark developments that really put us on a path to ending this system completely happened in the early 2000s. The first was the launching of the euro. Now, there are a number of reasons why the euro is perhaps not the best idea and was not exactly well thought out when it was put together. It was ultimately a political goal to knit the European Union together. Hard to argue with the political goal there. You know, a Europe that's united in peace, I think everybody has an interest in that. But the Europeans also had a clear and somewhat aggressive goal for the euro to displace the US dollar as the sole settler of the global system. Now, the United States looked at this and like, wait a minute. So we're subsidizing your system. We're protecting you from everyone. We're helping you knit Central and Eastern Europe back into the European family. And you want us to pay for it? Now, that didn't really go over very well. And that was one of the first things that kind of led the United States to break away from this global management system, because if the firmest allies we've ever had, the ones that we've poured the most military force and economic strength into supporting, we're now trying to take everything that the Americans did and make it work against the American interests, it was kind of rude. That was step one. Step two is the EP-3, if you remember that event. It was a spy plane that the United States was operating off the coast of China in international waters, and a Chinese fighter pilot collided with it, crashed. The Chinese got the plane, kept the crew for a couple of weeks, and the plane itself for a few months. And the Americans are looking at the Chinese like, look, after we met with Mao, we admitted China into the Bretton Woods family. And the fact that China by that time had already quadrupled its GDP was only possible because the Chinese, for the first time in Chinese history, were united under Chinese history and had access to the international system and were able to grow. And yet, you're trying to push us out of the security envelope. Again, rude. And since then, Chinese relations have steadily gotten worse. Final event, of course, was 9/11. Now, you can argue left, right, and center about how the United States may have mismanaged its response to the 9/11 attacks. But when you look around the world at the countries that chose to cooperate with the United States in American foreign policy in the aftermath of 9/11 and those that didn't, most of our traditional allies were in the no category. This was an issue that for the Americans was considered of paramount importance, and to have countries like France and Germany and Turkey just wanting to stay out of it, the whole idea of Bretton Woods, we subsidize you, but we get control of the security apparatus. The deal was broken. And from 2001 until today, it's been bleeding away. And you can just look at the presidents and how they've acted. So under Bill Clinton, he's the one who inherited the old system. He started to do an update with the World Trade Organization and with NAFTA, two of the biggest trade deals we've ever done. And he tried to change the terms of those deals to involve issues that were not pure security. Things like migration, things like labor standards, things like environmental standards. Try to shift the world into a more egalitarian direction. Then you get to George W. Bush, who instead of trying to push the global trade system forward, just put together a few mid-sized deals that for the most part were to reward specific allies. Jordan, Israel, Morocco, Singapore, Australia, Korea. Not insignificant deals, but nothing compared to what had come before. Then you had Barack Obama. The American interest in the entire industry vanished. And now we have Donald Trump, who is looking to peel back as many of them as possible. Whoever won the presidency back in 2016 was going to be the president who was going to rule over the end of the global order. With Hillary Clinton, it would have happened relatively slowly over 4 to 8 years. There would have been pamphlets and PowerPoints and timetables. It would be very, very, very organized. Under Donald Trump, it's happening over 4 to 8 tweets. But we're getting to the same place. Now, the time frame doesn't really matter to the United States, but it matters hugely to the rest of the world because everything about the global system is predicated on the concept of global order. The US makes shipping safe. The US prevents trade conflicts from ever rising up to the level of gunfire. Think of what happens to the energy market without that, or the agricultural market, or the manufacturer's market. Everything that makes almost every economy in the world work requires American security Overwatch. There's one exception, and that's the United States. Because for the Americans, trade was always about security. So the United States is the least involved economy in the world. Right now, only about 7.5% of American GDP comes from merchandise exports, and about 45% of that's within NAFTA. So if the United States can figure out its own regional neighborhood, the rest of the global system doesn't matter. And the piece of the global system that the US has traditionally cared the most about has been energy. The shale revolution has eradicated that. Break-even price for oil production in America's shale fields is now under $40 a barrel. And at today's price of just under 70, every shale field in the United States is economically viable. So the United States, in the worst case scenario, is going to be fully energy independent by the end of 2020. Could happen a lot faster if geopolitical events nudge us in that direction. And that doesn't even count the 3 million barrels a day that we get from Canada that functionally make us oil independent last year. One of the things that Bretton Woods really changed about how we manufacture goods is it took security out of the equation. So before the Bretton Woods system kicked in, you didn't have long supply chains because at any stage of the process, you could have a war, even if you weren't the target of the war, even if you weren't a participant, and it could interrupt one stage of the process, and all of a sudden you don't have finished good. What Bretton Woods did is removed any concern for security. So we used to have all of our manufacturers done in kind of a single industrial conglomerate city. You would bring in raw materials, local infrastructure, local populations, local workforce would process that into intermediate and then finished goods in the same place. And then they would be exported throughout the country, throughout the world. Now we've taken those singular cities and broken up into dozens, hundreds, thousands of steps. The iPhone, for example, 1,200 different facilities in 50 different countries. You can do that in a globalized system when no one's shooting each other. But as soon as people start shooting at each other, all of a sudden you no longer have iPhones. Automotive is another great example of how that works. It's 30,000 pieces. And if you only get 29,999 pieces, you don't have a car. These multimodal supply chains run around the world. The only way that the United States has really participated in this huge dispersion of the supply chain system is when it comes to different price points for different steps of the process. So for example, if you're doing high-end design of microchips, you're going to want the best engineers in the world. That's going to get done in Silicon Hills in the Austin area or Silicon Valley in the San Jose area. There's a flat done. But if you're making the case for a computer that's really just molded plastic, you might do that in Vietnam. Because the United States is the world's largest market, and because we're, how should we put this, somewhat finicky, and we are kind of addicted to next day delivery, anything that pulls those production pieces closer to home is generally perceived as better. And because the United States has a low-cost manufacturing location right on its southern border, it's perfect. So what NAFTA has done is given the United States kind of a mini global system here in North America, with the high-end stuff based on what it is being done in the United States, being done in Canada, and the mid-tech stuff and some of the lower stuff in Mexico and the Central American countries. So we get kind of a global system in miniature, but even that is only about 5% of our GDP. But if you take all other American trade put together, you're talking about roughly 5 to 7% of GDP, depending on who's doing the math. A lot of that is energy trade, where we export very high quality oil, and the rest of the world provides us with very low quality oil, which means that you can fudge that. You're now down talking to 3 to 5% of GDP. Most of that is going to be in the realm of manufactured goods. Look at what's happening with technology these days. Automation, robotics, algorithms, 3D printing. All of those technologies argue for having a more concentrated supply chain system with fewer steps as close to the end consumer as possible, which means all that's coming back to the United States anyway. So now we're talking about services, financial primarily. If you've got a global system that breaks down, people are going to be working overtime to try to get their money from unsafe locations to safe locations. The United States is already the #1 destination for capital flight. Even in the age of Trump, it's only going to pick up. So we'll probably have if everything was cut off tomorrow, we'd probably have a recession that would give us an adjustment of 3 to 5% of GDP for a few months. And then we'd move on. The Chinese economic system is based on integration with the global system. Originally importing capital, absolutely importing technology, having value added within the Chinese system at a relatively low cost point, building an industrial base that can achieve many of these global economies of scale locally, because you've got 1 billion people to work with, and then bringing in steps of the supply chain from Korea, Taiwan, Japan, the Southeast Asian states to fill out the rest of the whole, kind of China Inc., if you will. That is only possible if they have unlimited access to bring in raw materials and energy from beyond their continent, if the financial system lubricates international financial flows to make this entire web work possible, if they have access to a hard currency paying consumer base of mammoth size, and regional and global security alignments mean that none of the people in this entire network, from raw material producers to manufacturing supply chain steps to end consumers, is interrupted ever. That's an awfully specific and large list of requirements that China is wholly unable to guarantee or even influence by itself. It is completely at the mercy of American commitment to the Bretton Woods system, a commitment that is now collapsing, which means that the Chinese need to find a fundamentally different economic model, and because their political system is based on their economic performance, a completely different political model. President Xi has seen this coming, and he spent the last 6 years consolidating the political space within the Chinese system and, in essence, publicly executing anyone who is an independent pole of power on live television so that the Chinese have no doubt who's in charge. And if you remember back to last November, when the Chinese Communist Party met at the Great Hall of the People, they basically made him dictator for life. And he has now consolidated more power unto his one person than any Chinese leader in history, including the emperors and including Mao, because he knows that the economic system is facing a high velocity crash that it's not going to survive. And if the Chinese have to make a choice between a China that is authoritarian, unified, closed off from the world and poor, or one with multiple power centers that can be exploited from the outside, where some provinces do well and others don't, and the whole thing fractures, for the Chinese, that's not a choice. For long-term winners, let's set North America to the side for a moment, because there's a lot of domestic things in the United States, Mexico, and Canada that are going to shape that in a direction that has nothing to do with the international system. But for the rest of the world, there's really 4 big winners. The first is Japan. Here's a country that, because of its demographic aging, has figured out a way to have a modern economy without having a workforce. It's all based on automation and forward-positioned facilities in countries they want good relations with. They have become the de facto determiners of what the Western Pacific looks like. And that means, among other things, an end to China as a significant power. That's something they like very much. The big challenge for them is, how do you digest politically the smaller countries that maybe don't have the best relationship with you? Korea's being at the top of that list. Moving over to the Western Hemisphere, Argentina. Argent-freaking-tina looks really good. Their topography is very similar to the United States. They've got the equivalent of the American Midwest and the Pampas. They've got naturally navigable interconnected waterways to serve as natural transport arteries. The climate is good. They get winter, so there's an insect kill, so the health system is good. They've got great wine, and they don't have any security challenges. There's no one within 5,000 miles of them that bears them ill will or has the capacity to get to them in the first place. So as Brazil falls, Argentina can pick up every bit of that looks interesting to them. And if you look at what their traditional exports are, oil, natural gas, iron, wheat, corn, poultry, pork, beef, in a world where global supply chains are breaking down and famine's probably coming back, they have everything that the world needs. And they're going to be able to get top dollar for it. Third country, France. Yes, they're in the EU. Yes, when it goes away, it's going to be a big problem. The French created the EU to achieve a political and strategic goal. They never saw it as an economic union. It's just like what the United States did with Bretton Woods. Sacrifice some economics in order to get some security strategic advantages. So the French never integrated into the EU as much as any of the other major members. So for them, it's like 15 to 20% of GDP is wrapped up in trade. For the Germans, it's 40 to 60% based on where you draw the line. So they will have a very painful adjustment period, but on the back end of this, not only are they not going to be involved in any of the wars of the disorder, they don't even border a country that is going to be near a front line. So they have Europe's second most powerful military and second most powerful navy, but no security challenges. They're an exporter of food. Their manufacturing supply chain base has been kept national because they're French. And they can even get energy from their former colonies relatively easily. So most of the challenges that the rest of the planet's going to be struggling with and failing to succeed with, the French have in hand at the start of the era. And then finally, there's Turkey. Turkey has everything that it needs nearby. It can get food from Southeast Europe, primarily Bulgaria and Romania. It can get energy from Iraqi Kurdistan or Azerbaijan. It's got NATO's second most powerful army. There's no country near it that can really hold a candle to it in a meaningful way. And they've got a phenomenally young demography. So all of these advantages will last not just for years, but for decades. The only problem the Turks have is while they're more powerful than anyone in their neighborhood, and maybe even more powerful than everyone in their neighborhood, they're not strong enough to go in all directions at the same time. So they're going to have to choose. And until they can solidify their political system, and right now they're in this transition from semi-democracy to hardcore dictatorship, that means one guy, Erdogan, has to make the decision, where does he want his country to go? Everyone else is trying to manipulate them into going a direction away from them. So one of the reasons the Russians were involved in Syria is to try to bait the Turks into Syria, because if the Turks are in Syria, they can't also be in Ukraine. But on the backside of this, Turkey may have made some bad security decisions, but they're going to be a self-sufficient country in a neo-imperial setup in a world that is largely chaotic and broken down. And that's actually pretty good. Largely everybody else. I mean, that's a bit of an overstatement. There are parts of the world that are going to do all right. Southeast Asia, I think, is going to kind of come into its own for the first time. But all of the regional power centers that we've become convinced of as the up-and-comers are ones that are, for the most part, dependent on the Bretton Woods system. So I would say that the two biggest losers are China and Germany. For the Chinese, everything about their political unity is predicated on international stability, which means that China reverts to something that's actually more normal in its history. Fighting regions, a lot of internal chaos, warlords. For 3,000 years of Chinese history, this is what about 2,500 of it looks like. This is more normal for them. That we're in the atypical period right now. Germany's more and less complicated. And we're talking about Germany here. I mean, this is a country that went from economic destitution in 1935 to invading France 6 years later. The German capacity for regeneration and rebuilding is immense. And just because their entire economy is going to collapse does not mean that the Germans are removed from the board. They will reinvent themselves. But every time they reinvent themselves, their neighbors usually don't like what it looks like. The challenge is figuring out what they're going to do. Germany is one of the most advanced countries in the world. It's become one of the big successes of the Bretton Woods system. Germany that's no longer warlike and genocidal, but is free and democratic and even a little pacifist. I mean, this is amazing. But you change the circumstances and that goes away. Germany right now imports roughly 85% of its energy. Roughly 2/3 of its GDP is in some way dependent upon exports. If you take that away, the Germans have a choice to make. They suffer a 3/4 reduction in their standard of living, and they give up on electricity, or they act like Germans and they find another way. The problem is there's no single place that they can go to get everything that they need. France has maybe half the market that they need, but all of Europe together doesn't have enough. The Yamal Peninsula in northwest Siberia has the energy that they need. Unfortunately, St. Petersburg and Moscow are in the way. There's no series of deals, there's no series of invasions that can give the Germans the standard of living that they enjoy today. It will drop catastrophically, and that will absolutely have political consequences. Can you imagine what would happen if we had the effect of the Great Depression concentrated into 1 year? because that's what the Germans are going to be dealing with. The political stress that will generate, the directions that will force the Germans to go, will not be pretty. The Europeans have a common currency, but because of national proclivities on things like banking and financing, there is no national authority that really regulates what the governments spend money on or for the banking sector itself. That split meant that a lot of Europeans got into debt at the state level. It also means that a lot of the European banks took advantage of cheap euro borrowing well beyond what they could have probably handled in the first place. And so the banks themselves have a bad debt load that it honestly is an order of magnitude larger than what's going on in the sovereign debt system. So you get these three different clusters of European countries, some which run it by the books, Germany, the Netherlands, some of which have massive sovereign debt issues, Ireland, Greece, and some which have massive private banking catastrophes waiting to happen, Italy. You put that all on the same system and you know bailouts in the trillions have to happen. How do you pay for that? Here in the United States, the Fed prints some currency, the Treasury issues debt, they talk, you get the two of them at a two-top in a bar, they've got it hacked out in an hour. In Europe, you have to have a meeting with 28 different members, with all their translators, and you have to find out who's going to pay for it because you can't just print the currency. So they confiscated insured bank deposits. Who wants that currency now? If you can have money in a European bank and the European government can just come in and take it to pay for someone else's bailout. And so ever since the Cypriot bailout, which was 7 years ago now, the European euro has collapsed as a mode of international financial exchange. They obviously still use it in Europe, but it is very clearly a local currency rather than a global one. I think now for trade finance internationally, it's dropped to number 5. It used to be number 1. So that's the euro. Next is the Japanese yen. Back in the 80s, the Japanese tried to internationalize, and that's right about the time they realized that their economic model had gone as far as they could. They faced a series of protracted recessions that led to 20 years of economic stagnation and the largest capital flight in the history of their country. So they stopped making it convertible. It's still technically out there, but it's only like 2% of global exchange. And it's not going to be a significant player again, especially now that the Japanese have offloaded their industrial plant and it's not even using the yen except for repatriating profits home. Next down is the yuan. Wow. Okay, in terms of gross monetary size, the Chinese yuan is by far the world's largest currency because the Chinese use a debt-driven model to drive their economic development. Doesn't matter if you can make a product or if you have a business plan or if it's a good idea. As long as you're employing people, that's the goal of their development model. Because people have jobs, they're not getting together in large groups and going on long walks together. Politburo doesn't like to see that. That's how they got their jobs. The other half of that is they just print currency like mad. So think of what America was doing at the height of QE. The Chinese were doing about 20 times that volume, just as a matter of course. So their monetary base is well over double the Americans, despite the fact that our economy is still over twice the size of theirs. That means if they have it convertible, all the money comes out. And what they've seen in the last 2 years is these baby steps they were taking towards full convertibility in an open account led to so much money flooding out that they had to shut it down. So they're not interested. Next one down is the pound. Hard currency, independent central bank, ticks all the boxes, but if there's one thing that everyone in the world agrees upon, it's that the Brits should never be in charge again. Who's next? Canada, Australia, Sweden, Denmark, New Zealand. That's all of the world's hard currencies. So if those countries were to combine to try to float a global currency, they'd probably only be able to manage a quarter of what the world would need. Think about what the global currency has to be. It has to have an agreed upon value. It has to be available in volume to lubricate international financial and trade movement. And the currency has to be run by a country that doesn't really care what its day-to-day value is, which means it can't be a trading country. If it was Japan or China, they'd intervene every day. That would just disqualify it right there. If it was China, it would have to be an open account. That disqualifies it. The only currency that can be the global currency is the US dollar, which is why we see whenever there's a period of international chaos, like the subprime crisis or the Asian financial crisis, the money floods to the United States because it's the only store of value that is accessible, that has rule of law, and that has enough bulk that the locals don't care what it does day to day. You can't have that anywhere else in the world. The United States has a young and growing population. Even into the Trump era, we still have inward immigration of skilled labor, large consumer base, large industrial base, and the technologies that are being developed right now and being applied in the United States are bringing industry back to the country even before you consider international breakdowns. Self-sufficient in energy, the United States' picture is bright. The trajectory is up. It might not be a straight line trajectory, but it's still very, very positive. If you're looking at Mexico, even in the worst case scenario with the Trump administration, you still have an industrialized country at a lower price point than the United States. It's all about the differential between wage costs. Everything that Trump is doing is pushing wages down in Mexico. The wider that differential is, the greater the case for economic integration between the United States and Mexico. So everything that Trump is doing is actually going to deepen the bilateral relationship. I'm not saying it's going to be as friendly as it has been, but it's going to get deeper. So that's all right. Southeast Asia, you've got a lot of countries that have always been exploited because foreigners could access them on their terms. If the global system gets more dangerous, all of a sudden it makes more sense to do some value-added manufacturing in a place like Indonesia. For the first time in their history, they might actually be able to modernize. But then, of course, there's plenty of dark spots. Brazil looks horrible. Germany's going to be nasty at best. The Russian Federation is literally dying out, and China's probably going to fall apart. The overall picture for the world is of a dark Darwinian future for at least the next 20 years, because that's how long it's going to take for a lot of these mid-sized powers to kind of reinvent themselves in a neo-imperial format. That's going to be ugly. That's going to be rough for democracy. That's certainly going to be rough for free market capitalism. And what emerges on the other side is going to be a much more dangerous place. So you got to pick your battles. For the most part, for the Americans, this is going to turn out just fine. The question in my mind is what happens on the back end. After 20 years of navel-gazing, of the Americans redefining themselves and coming back together, reformulating their political parties into a new, more stable form, finally having that conversation with ourselves about what we actually want. We're going to look out in the world and realize it's the world that we thought was there is gone. And we're going to have to start all over again. It's going to be like the 1890s. We had come out of Reconstruction and the world had changed, but we didn't let that stop